Hello and welcome to the Daily News Simplified, the what, why, and how of the newspaper analysis from a civil service examinations perspective. So today we are going to discuss the Hindu Delhi edition dated 27th April 2023. The important topics which are to be discussed have been displayed on the screen, and the timestamping of the same has been provided in the description box below. So now let us begin our today's session. So now let us begin with our first topic. This topic reads, Supreme Court modifies order on ESZ, which stands for Ecologically Sensitive Zone. So basically Supreme Court has modified its recent order on ESZ around the protected areas. This is the very context of this news article. This item has appeared at page number 6 in today's The Hindu Delhi edition, and basically when it comes to the UPSC scheme of syllabus, this topic finds its relevance under GS 3 section, Environment and Ecology. So that is why in today's session we are going to discuss that what do you mean by ecologically sensitive zones, what are the legislative provisions in this regard, what is the basic concept of ESZ and how it has evolved in India. Further, we will also analyze this topic in the context of the center as well as state's power. So now let us begin our discussion in detail. So first of all, let us understand that what do you mean by ecologically sensitive zone. So we all are aware about certain concept of protected areas. What are protected areas? Basically the protected areas are like national parks, wildlife sanctuaries, etc. So the basic aim of notifying certain areas as national parks and wildlife sanctuary is as to reduce the human interference in these areas so that we can protect the natural forest as well as biodiversity in these protected areas. But then an issue arises. Issue is that we need to balance our environmental responsibilities with our economic imperatives. That is, we need to have the economic development in our country, but that economic development should not hamper the environmental sustainability. So that is why it is said the concept of sustainable development must be promoted. And this is the very concept which has led to the development of such concepts like protected areas, ecologically sensitive zones, etc. But then there are certain issues involved in it. So to understand those issues, first let us have a look on the overview of certain environmental legislations. So in this regard, basically there are 4 acts: Wildlife Protection Act, Environment Protection Act, Forest Rights Act, as well as PISA Act. We understand the thing that most of the forests are inhabited by certain tribal communities as well as non-tribal groups, which are also known as the forest dwelling communities. So basically you try to understand that if we are designating any particular area as, let's say, a national park, this will mean that it will curtail certain economic activities, which in turn can also impact the right to livelihood of tribal as well as forest dwelling communities. Right? So let us understand that what is the basic aim of Wildlife Protection Act. Basically, it is under this act that various protected areas like national parks or wildlife sanctuaries are notified. Basically, it is protecting the wildlife, and that is why it is heavily tilted towards the curtailing of rights. For example, several economic activities like thermal power plants, industries which are polluting in nature, infrastructure construction, etc. are prohibited in these protected areas so as to basically conserve the wildlife. Then we have Environment Protection Act 1986, which basically deals with the provisions related to controlling the pollution. Forest Rights Act 2006 aims at protecting and conserving the rights of the forest dwelling communities. These forest rights can be of individual in nature as well as can be collective in nature. Basically, the Forest Rights Act aims to protect and conserve the rights of the forest dwelling tribal communities which are inhabiting the forest areas. This basically aims to protect the customary rights. Now comes the PISA Act. PISA Act has extended the grassroots democracy, that is the provisions related to the local governance, for example panchayat, in certain special areas known as scheduled areas. Basically in these areas, the local authorities, that is the Gram Sabha, has given adequate power to protect the rights of the local communities. Similarly, in the Forest Rights Act 2006 also, adequate powers have been provided to the Gram Sabha to protect the rights of forest dwelling communities, right? Now understand that what is ecologically sensitive zone. Ecologically sensitive areas are basically the regions which is surrounding the protected areas. So let's say for example, this is some national park or wildlife sanctuary, basically the protected areas. Okay. So now let us imagine that if this is the protected areas and we know that the rights of infrastructure creation in these areas are restricted, but outside these areas obviously one cannot restrict the rights of economic activities or the livelihoods of the people. So that is why, let's say if I am building an industry in the vicinity of these protected areas, it can have a detrimental effect on these protected areas also. So that is why in order to conserve these areas, we need to have a second layer of protection. That is why the areas which surround these protected areas, for example in this manner, they are known as ecologically sensitive areas. So basically the population or the economic activity will be living mostly outside these ecologically sensitive areas. Okay. Obviously population or community will be living in these ecologically sensitive areas also. In general sense, all the economic rights will be existing outside these ESZ areas. Certain economic rights will be provided within the ESZ areas, and almost negligible rights are provided within the boundaries of national parks. So this is the ecologically sensitive zone. Now we can understand that these areas are acting as a transitional boundaries. They are acting as the protector to already protected areas. And that is why it is said that ESZ basically are the insulating layers. So under the Wildlife Conservation Strategy 2002, it was said that the areas of 10 kilometer surrounding the boundaries of such protected areas will be notified as ecologically sensitive zones. And this notification was to come under the ambit of Environment Protection Act 1986. But then in 2005, the central government asked the state governments as well as union territories to propose their own ecologically sensitive areas or ecologically sensitive zones. In 2006, the Supreme Court intervened and it asked the central government, or more precisely Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, to submit the proposals within 4 weeks. So this proposal was to be submitted in 4 weeks, but even after 4 years, that is 2010, nothing concrete or nothing much had happened. And that is why in 2011, the Supreme Court again intervened. On the basis of this intervention, then in the next year, that is 2012, the notification for the ESZ started. But still, again, the policies, the legislations which deal with the environmental protection are marred by huge red tapeism and bureaucratic attitude. Despite the fact that in 2012 the notification for ESZ started, even now we do not have clear guidelines or procedures in place, and many a times these guidelines and procedures come in direct conflict with various existing environmental legislations. And the reason being that these environmental legislations are at different objectives. For example, the Wildlife Protection Act is having a curtailing nature. On the other hand, the Forest Rights Act is providing the rights to the local communities. So many a times it happens that Wildlife Protection Act and Forest Rights Act come in conflict with each other. And then under so much of confusion and complexities, last year in 2022, the Supreme Court gave an order that 1 kilometer region beyond the boundary of all the protected areas will be considered as ecologically sensitive zones. So let's say if this is the protected area, then beyond this up to 1 kilometer of range, the ecologically sensitive zones will be implemented, and all the strict guidelines. For example, there are certain activities which are restricted or prohibited, there are certain activities which are regulated, and then there are certain activities which are permitted. So all the important guidelines which are there in place will be implemented, will be mandatory to be implemented in this 1 kilometer zone. Against this order, there were protests across India. So now let us see that in detail what did Supreme Court said in 2022. Ministry of Environment's guidelines in relation to the ecological sensitive zones will be implemented in the areas proposed in the draft notification. So this notification was still in the draft stage, and despite this fact, the Supreme Court said that all the guidelines have to be implemented. Further, this draft notification is still awaited. It is still not yet finalized. It also said these guidelines will also be implemented in the region of 10 km around the protected areas, as well as those protected areas which were still proposed. Then it also gave the powers to the state government, that the state governments can increase or decrease the areas of these ESZ on their own. Then it banned all the new structures to be created within the ESZ region. And then it said that for those projects which were being already carried out can continue, but on one condition, that is the designated authority, which in this case is the Principal Chief Conservator Officer. This authority gives the permission within the span of 6 months. But then even now these permissions are not being granted, and this time span of 6 months have passed long ago. So if this 6 months period has passed, now what we have to do, it was not there in the guidelines of the Supreme Court. So that is why. Further, if the Supreme Court has said that all the new structures will be banned, so it will directly hamper the right to livelihood for the people living in ecologically sensitive areas, which might come in direct conflict with the Forest Rights Act. Further, these new structures can also include like electric poles, walls, roads, etc., which are the basic necessities in today's time. So that is why today's article said that Supreme Court has modified the order, because it has said that one size fits all approach will not be valid in India, whatever is the context is. And that is why even in this context, the ecological sensitive zones must be constructed taking the local needs into account, the local topography into account, the unique characteristics of all these protected areas into account, and hence a regional approach must be followed. So this is basically the concept related to ecologically sensitive zones. Now we shall also look at which are certain those activities which are prohibited, regulated and permitted within the ESZ. So first, the commercial mining is prohibited. Second, all those industries which cause pollution are also prohibited for obvious reason. Similarly, production of hazardous wastes, discharge of various effluents which might lead to pollution, these activities are prohibited. Certain activities are regulated, that is, under some conditions they are allowed. For example, felling of trees. Second, commercial use of natural water resources. Third, polythene bags by certain shops. Fourth, widening of roads. Similarly, there are certain activities which are permitted over here, like organic farming, even the agriculture or the horticulture which is practiced by local communities in these areas, rainwater harvesting, as well as development of renewable sources of energy. So these are certain activities which are prohibited, regulated, as well as permitted in the ESZ. So this was all in relation to the ecologically sensitive zones. Still the guidelines are very complex and confusing, and still it is yet to be seen that how this law will take its place. So let us revise this topic in brief once again. This topic has appeared at page number 6 in today's The Hindu Delhi edition in the context that Supreme Court has modified its order on ESZ. So initially we discussed that what is the basic concept of ecologically sensitive zones, what are protected areas, why these protected areas are created. Then we had an overview regarding the broad objectives of Wildlife Protection Act 1972, Environment Protection Act, Forest Rights Act, as well as the Peace Act. And we also saw that how these acts may come in conflict with each other because their overall objectives might be conflicting to each other. For example, this Wildlife Protection Act was having a rights negative approach. On the other hand, Forest Rights Act as well as PISA Act is a right positive approach. After this, we discuss that what is the broad aim of ecological sensitive zones, under which strategy it came into existence, under which law it has to be notified. Then we saw the evolution, intervention by Supreme Court, by center, by state, and formulation of certain guidelines and procedures related to this. However, then in the end we saw that what were those orders which were given by Supreme Court in 2022, and in the last we saw that what are the various activities according to the existing guidelines and procedures which are prohibited, regulated and permitted within the ecologically sensitive zones. Now this topic has appeared at page number 1. The news is very disheartening as far as the India's internal security apparatus is concerned. Recently, 10 security personnel as well as a civilian were killed when Maoists blew up their vehicles in Dantewada district of the state of Chhattisgarh. Now this Chhattisgarh is one of the most notorious regions when it comes to the Maoist and Naxalite movements. When you go by the UPSC scheme of syllabus, this topic will find its relevance in General Studies Mains Paper 3 in the subsection of Internal Security. And every year at least 1 to 2 questions are asked in this very regard in GS Mains Paper 3. So that is why let us look at some of the key facts and trends related to this particular thing. As far as the present scenario is concerned, and if we compare this with the past period, there is a general decrease in the left-wing extremism in India. The data show that currently the Maoist violence in the country has gone down by 77%. Similarly, the number of resultant deaths, security forces as well as civilians, has come down by 90% according to the data provided by the Ministry of Home Affairs. And that is why in similar manner, the government has also cut down the number of districts which were affected by the Naxalism. Earlier it was 200 and now it is just around 90, which shows that the geographical spread of the Naxalite movement has restricted. The states like Andhra Pradesh, Telangana, Odisha, Jharkhand and Bihar, which at one point of time were known for high intensity Naxal attacks, have reduced the presence of Naxals to almost zero. But then the question arises that if it can happen in these states, then why not in Chhattisgarh? Areas like Dantewada, Sukma every year are prone to Naxal attacks. So let us see that what are those unique factors which are operating in Chhattisgarh and has not provided the same results as in the other states, and why still the Naxalism is continuing in this particular state. The first and the foremost factor is in relation to the security apparatus. In other states, the local police was actively involved in curbing the Naxalite movements. However, in Chhattisgarh, there is a dominance of the Central Reserve Police Force, which comes under the central government and not the state government. So experts are of the opinion that if we are able to tap the potential of the local police, we can have a better results. The reason being, local police is more aware about the local conditions. They know the local languages. Their intelligence network in those areas is very good. So that is why the local police must be trained in order to curb this menace. The second important factor is that Chhattisgarh has dense forests as well as a very rugged terrain. And these areas therefore are well suited for the Naxals which hide in these areas and then they do attack. The third is the level of infrastructure, for example, roads, hospitals, schools, etc., which are still not present in Chhattisgarh as compared to the other states like Bihar, Andhra, Telangana, etc. Then the socio-economic development of Chhattisgarh is again below than the other states, and that is why, because of the prevalence of poverty and unemployment, the youth is easily lured, and that is why they join these forces. So all these factors have led to the continuation of Naxalite and Maoist movements in the state of Chhattisgarh. But then, to curb this, the government has taken various steps. So let us see that what measures have been taken by government to tackle the left-wing extremism. First, the central government supports the left-wing extremism hit states through security-related expenditure. Now, what do you mean by security-related expenditure? It is basically that expenditure which is dedicatedly focused towards equipping the security forces to fight the Maoist movements. Second, similarly, the special infrastructure scheme is also run by the central government, aiming to strengthen the local police and intelligence setups. Third, we have already discussed that the central government has a special central assistance which it provides to the state governments in the form of massive presence of central reserved police force in the affected states. Further, the center is also pushing up creating the communication networks like mobile towers as well as other social infrastructure which can bring in the technical intelligence and also raise the socio-economic developmental levels. Further, the institutional agencies like NIA, ED are also keeping a close vigil on their leaders, cadres as well as sympathizers so that to choke their presence and choke their funding. Further, the CRPF has also raised a Bastaria battalion, which is a special and dedicated force comprising of the recruits which are taken from the local population. They are given training that how they could generate intelligence, they know the language, they know the terrain, and that is how the CRPF is also taking its bit to tap the potential of the local population in this area. So these are certain measures which are taken to tackle the left-wing extremism, and these things we have discussed in relation to this news which has appeared at page number 1 in today's newspaper. This topic has appeared at the text and the context page and is in relation to the India's nuclear liability law. The immediate context of this very news article is that there are certain issues regarding India's nuclear liability law that has stalled the work on the Jaitapur nuclear power project located in the state of Maharashtra. This is one of the world's biggest nuclear power generation site under construction. But because of the legal complexities involved and the conflict therein, this work has been stalled. And we know that how much importance the renewable power generation capacity holds when it comes to the Indian commitment in regard to the renewable power generation. So that is why in today's session we are going to learn that what is the nuclear liability law and what is the issue involved. First of all, understand that what is the nuclear liability. Basically, whenever there is a nuclear power plant and if certain fault appears in that plant, for example, we know about the Chernobyl incident. Similarly, we are also aware about the nuclear power incidents in Japan. So what happens is that whenever there is some destruction or some fault which appears in the nuclear power plants, then who will be responsible for it? Whose liability will be it? Whether it will be the operator's liability or it will be the supplier's liability. That means, let's say India is a country, and in India the nuclear power equipments have been sent by some other country, let us imagine A. In India, these nuclear plants are being operated by, let's say, NPCIL. So now if there is a fault in India in any nuclear power plant, then who will be accountable, who will be liable for it? Whether the operator, that is who was operating that plant, or the supplier who has supplied certain equipments of this plant. So this is the very basic question which is there in the liability law, and also the main reason for the issue. So as far as the India is concerned, the laws on the civil nuclear liability ensures that the compensation is available to the victims for the nuclear damage caused by a nuclear incident or disaster, and sets out who will be liable for those damages. So therefore, in India, the liability is there on the operator as well as on the supplier also. So let us see that what is the issue. First of all, there is an international convention, which is the Umbrella Convention, the Convention on Supplementary Compensation. This was adopted in 1997 and India has ratified this. It aims at establishing a minimum national compensation amount, that is, which can be used to provide the compensation to the victims. Further, it also says that if this amount is insufficient, then the amount can be further increased through the public funds. That is, the government can step in if it feels that the compensation amount is insufficient as provided by this particular convention. Now, India is a signatory to this convention, ratified this convention in 2016, but prior to 2016, India was having its own nuclear law, which is the Civil Liability for Nuclear Damage Act. This act was passed in 2010, and this is the act which puts the liability on the supplier as well as on the operator. There are main provisions related to the compensation which is to be provided by this act. For example, it provides that strict and no fault liability will be put on the operator of the nuclear plant, where it will be held liable for the damage. Further, it also specifies the amount the operator will have to pay out in case of nuclear damage caused by an accident, and this amount is rupees 1500 crore. In case the damage exceeds this particular amount, that is 1500 crore, the act says that the government can step in and it will provide the funds further restricted to 23 crore. Further, the act also specifies the limitations on the amount and time when action for compensation can be brought against the operator. Now we shall look at what does it say on the supplier liability. As we have discussed that the international legal framework puts the liability of the nuclear damage only on the operator, which is the exclusive liability on the operator, which means that international legal framework does not put the liability on the supplier of the equipments. However, there are two conditions for it. The international legal framework says that the liability of the supplier can be fixed in case both the parties, that is both the countries, enter into a bilateral agreement, or if it is proven that the supplier has a malefic intention to cause damage to the importing country. So in that case also the liability on the supplier can be put on. But then the question is that how will one prove that the intention was to cause damage? Despite this fact, India's liability law goes beyond these two conditions, and therefore it introduced the concept of supplier liability over and above the operators in its civil nuclear liability law. It says that if the nuclear incident has resulted as a consequence of an act of supplier or his employee, which includes the supply of equipment or material with patent or latent defects or substandard services. In all these conditions, the liability on the supplier will also be put. Further, there is one more issue in it. The section 46 of the law says that the supplier will not only be liable under this Civil Nuclear Liability Act, but he can be put liable under other acts also, that is, other existing civil laws. And that is why in this particular act, operator is liable only within the ambit of this act, but the supplier is liable under this act also as well as other civil laws, and that is why it exposes the suppliers to unlimited amounts of liability. And this is the very reason that why several countries are hesitant in supplying the nuclear equipments for the nuclear power plant generation in India. So this is all about today's article, which has appeared in text and context page in relation to the nuclear. Now this topic has appeared at page number 12 in today's The Hindu Delhi edition. And as you can see, the topic is in relation to the United Nations reforms. The immediate context of this very news article is that India has lashed out at the UN system with its most scathing attack and said that there is an urgent need to reform the United Nations and especially the United Nations Security Council. India's permanent representative has called UN Charter as anachronistic, adding that it has failed in handling the COVID-19 pandemic, the Ukraine war, terrorism, climate change, and n number of factors where UN has failed. And therefore, there is an urgent need that it must be reformed. So under today's session, we will discuss about one specific part, that is United Nations Security Council. We will discuss that what is UNSC, its structure, why UNSC reforms are needed and what are the specific areas where UNSC reforms are needed. And then we'll discuss in the end that what is the case for India's permanent membership stake at United Nations. First of all, we must know that UNSC stands for United Nations Security Council, and this is a principal crisis management body, and it has the power to issue binding obligations. Now this word is important. Binding obligations on all the members of the United Nations. It has three core roles. First is ensuring the international peace and security. Second is UNSC has its role in selection and appointment of the new members to the United Nations. It gives its recommendation to the General Assembly of the United Nations. And third is any change in the UN Charter or any modification in the UN Charter must be approved by the United Nations Security Council. And when we talk about the UNSC, the most important thing is the P5 group. Now what is P5? We'll discuss it. UNSC has two types of members. One are the permanent members and other are the non-permanent members. Now there are 5 permanent members which are known as P5, that is permanent 5. Now these members, as the name signifies, are permanent in nature. China, France, Russia, UK and USA. Now these 5 countries are permanent members, and the most special thing about permanent members are that they have a veto power. Now veto power means that on any issue which is being debated in UNSC, these countries have the veto power. For example, let's say if country A attacks the country B and UNSC decides to sanction the country A, and just one country out of these 5 countries votes against this sanction, that sanction cannot be imposed on it because that particular country has vetoed it. But the problem is that this veto power is only available to these 5 countries. The next are the non-permanent members, which are 10 in number, and they are appointed on rotation basis, giving adequate representation on geographical terms. That means all the continents will be given adequate representation. But this geographical representation is restricted only to the non-permanent membership and not to the permanent membership. Now there are certain issues and challenges in which UN is lacking, and that is why we need reforms in certain areas. Now, first of all, if you closely analyze that these are the five permanent members, and out of these, just look USA, UK, and Russia, and the erstwhile, which was known as Soviet Union in the post World War II era, were the major powers. And that is why this permanent membership symbolizes the World War II period, post World War II period. And that is why there is a power disbalance among these five countries and the other complete world. But now, if we talk about the present situation, that geopolitical situation has changed a lot. Now, country like India is emerging with its full might. Now, there is a huge socio-economic and cultural importance of the countries of Africa. For example, Japan is one of the most industrialized nations of not only Asia but of the whole world. Similarly, Brazil has also its importance at the global geopolitical level. So the point is that presently the geopolitical situation has changed a lot since World War II, and that is why there must be a reform and UN must do away with this restricted five permanent member formula. The second important thing is that if you closely again understand this membership, only one country, that is China, is from Asia, right? So there is inequitable representation. Europe is overrepresented because Europe as a continent is very small and it supports a very minuscule share of world population. But if you see the countries, we have France and UK from Europe. Then Asia, we have discussed, is underrepresented because Asia is a very huge continent, but we have just one representative, that is China. And Africa and South America, so large continents, but they have zero representation. The third major issue is of legitimacy and credibility, the latest example being the Russian-Ukraine war. In the past also there have been several invasions, for example in Libya, in Egypt, in Iraq, Syria, Yemen. So there have been continuous invasions going on across the world, but UNSC has failed to stop those invasions and take the necessary steps. That is why in present times UNSC face the crisis of legitimacy and credibility. The north-south divide is the continuation of this very issue, because if you divide the world into two halves, that is north and south, most of the countries, for example China, France, Russia, UK and USA, all these countries are in the north. Then the latest issue is that present times are witnessing the emerging new issues to which UNSC is completely new. For example, in present times, due to globalization, economic interdependence is rising. Environmental degradation has become one of the most widespread threatening phenomena for the entire humanity. And moreover, the transnational threats, for example, terrorism, is becoming highly modified. Now we have cyber attacks. Now the organized crime is becoming high tech. So presently UNSC is not able to cater all these emerging issues. And the last issue is the relationship between the Security Council and General Assembly of the United Nations. There have been a lack of coordination and continuous friction among these two parts. So these are the broader reforms which are needed in UNSC. Now we will discuss the case for India's permanent membership, because India is one of the torchbearers to reform the UNSC. So whenever we have to discuss the case for some country, we must look the geopolitical significance of that particular country. And that is why we will analyze the geopolitical significance of India also in this regard. First of all, India has around 1/6 of the global population. That means the demographic power is huge with India. Second is, India is the largest democracy of the world, and that is why it is believed that India's entry into UNSC will provide UNSC with the required democratic values. For example, we all are aware about the hardcore geopolitical stance of countries like USA, Russia and China. If India enters into the permanent five grouping, then it is believed that India will stand for those countries who are not very strong, and thereby will put their democratic principles and values into UNSC. Next comes the economic might. Now, factually, India was the fifth largest economy in 2019, and as far as the purchasing power parity is concerned, India ranks third globally. So that means that India is among the top 5 economic powers. Now come military. India is a responsible nuclear power, being the third largest military spender and one of the largest standing armies. Further, India's contribution to the United Nations is also very huge. India is the largest contributor to the United Nations peacekeeping operations, which majorly is deployed in the countries of Africa. So that means that India's contribution to United Nations is also very huge. First, at the geopolitical scale also, the latest example again being the Russian-Ukrainian war. India has active participation in the global geopolitics. Further, India is also one of the 4 members. The grouping is known as G4 members. India is a member along with Brazil, Germany, and Japan. And the major goal of G4 grouping is to reform the United Nations Security Council, and all these countries support each other's bid for the permanent membership in the UNSC.